Is there an irreconcilable contradiction between Luke and Matthew's accounts of Jesus' birth? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. Let's take a look at a video.
If Matthew is right, that they went down to Egypt for months or years or however long, how can Luke be right that they immediately returned to Nazareth?
And what is the answer to that question from
I
the
don't know.
perspective of a Christian?
I don't know. I mean, you have to make something up.
In this video, New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman offers Alex O'Connor an example of what he believes to be an irreconcilable contradiction in the Christmas account.
So before we get to this creator's response to these claims, I want to jump in real quick and share two concerns I have. And I'm doing this, one, because I want to break up the video a little bit so it's not so monotonous. But more importantly, I want to make you aware of some methodological flaws here so that when you watch the response, you can see these apologetic machinations and sleights of hand in action. And that will allow you to see much more clearly the game that is being played here. And the first concern I want to share is the fact that there is a whole web of contradictions between these two accounts of the nativity. And what's going on here is one of them is being reconciled in isolation from all the others. And you're going to see that this reconciliation requires appeal to assumptions about other contradictions. In other words, they're going to appeal to other features of these narratives as evidence, but they only function as evidence if you already presuppose they're not contradictions. And I'll give you an example here. Matthew's account does not have Mary and Joseph living originally in Nazareth. They live in Bethlehem. They go to Egypt. They try to come back to Bethlehem, but they can't because Herod Archelaus has taken over rule after the death of Herod the Great. And so they are warned in a dream to go north into the Galilee. And the text says that they settle in Nazareth. They don't return to Nazareth. It doesn't refer to Nazareth as their own town like it does in the Gospel of Luke. They are settling for the first time in Nazareth. So this content creator is going to presuppose that all the other details of these narratives are harmonious. And they're going to presuppose that in Matthew, they are returning to Nazareth, but they're not. The text describes them settling originally in Nazareth because they can't return home to Bethlehem. So that's just one example. And the other methodological flaw here is the classic apologetic retreat to this notion that all apologists have to do is gin up the tiniest little sliver of not impossible. They're not trying to find out what's most likely. They're not looking for the best reading of the text. They're just looking to show that the harmonization, the reconciliation of these two accounts is not literally, logically, physically impossible. Because if they can just show it's not impossible, then that's enough space for their audience to be vindicated, to feel validated, to feel justified in their belief. That is the main goal of apologetics. And so what's going on here, even though they're not being open about this, what's going on here is they're just attempting to show that it's not logically and physically impossible for these two accounts to be reconciled, even if it is wildly implausible. So now on to the response.
Now, before we look at the specific supposed contradiction, let me make a general observation. Many alleged Bible contradictions arise from applying unnecessary assumptions or false expectations to the Bible. In many cases, the alleged contradiction stems from the reader misunderstanding or even misrepresenting the author's original intent. Let me show you what I mean. Ehrman challenges his students to read the Christmas accounts in Matthew and Luke and make a list of events for each. What you will find is some similarity, like Jesus being born in Bethlehem, of a virgin, and after his birth returning to Nazareth. But you will also find differences, like the Magi and the trip to Egypt in Matthew, and the shepherds and the trip to the temple in Luke. While Matthew and Luke give some different details, it's not clear that this amounts to a genuine contradiction. Here's why. For this to be a genuine contradiction, the reader must assume two things. First, they assume that silence about an event is denial of an event. But this is a textbook example of an argument from silence, trying to reason from what a source does not say to the conclusion that something did not happen. Since Luke is silent on Jesus going to Egypt, the argument goes, therefore Luke denies Jesus went to Egypt. True, Luke doesn't mention the trip to Egypt, but what follows from that? The answer's simple. Nothing. Luke's silence is not a denial. Now I know what you're thinking, but Tim, Luke says when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. There it is. Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Nazareth. This leads to the second assumption. Second, the reader assumes Luke's describing immediate consecutive events. Luke does say that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus returned to Nazareth, and it says that it was after making sacrifices for ritual purification in Jerusalem. The question is, was it immediately after or eventually after? Well, Matthew seems to hint that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus had a longer stay in Bethlehem, possibly even 2 years. This might explain why Herod ordered the killing of all the male children in Bethlehem 2 years and under. So can these two accounts be reconciled? Yeah, and I don't think it's terribly hard to see how. Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem. Jesus is born and the shepherds visit. 40 days after Jesus' birth, they go to the temple in Jerusalem to fulfill the law. Then they return to their home in Bethlehem. They meet the Magi. Then, after being warned in a dream about Herod's plot, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus flee to Egypt to escape. Finally, when Herod is dead, they begin to travel back to Judea, to Bethlehem. But after being warned in another dream, they go to Nazareth instead. This series of events is totally consistent with both accounts.
So this argument begins by laying some initial rhetorical groundwork by suggesting that people who don't think these texts can be reconciled are misunderstanding and misrepresenting the text and the author and their intentions. And then there are two assumptions that are identified. One is an argument from silence, and the other is the assumption that in Luke 2:39, the temporal conjunction host that is being used there, once they had fulfilled all that was required by the law, they returned to their own home in Nazareth. The assumption is that that temporal conjunction means immediately after. And the argument is that this is unwarranted, that any amount of time could have taken place between the completion of the requirements and their returning to Nazareth. And they try to make it sound like these are not just desperate attempts to gin up the tiniest little sliver of not impossible, but that's precisely what they are. The creator is trying to make it sound like it's just so obvious. It's not hard at all to reconcile these things, when all they're doing is saying, as long as we presuppose that they are harmonious, we can then make all the assumptions we want about what happened in the gaps of the narrative. But this is problematic because if we take Luke at their word, the author of the Gospel of Luke begins by saying they have closely followed everything and are setting out a well-ordered and accurate account. So they should be telling us the main details. Now, we have Jesus being born, and they get to go to the temple. They get to meet an old couple that was promised they would see the Savior. They fulfill the requirements regarding purification and all this, and then they go back home. Oh, but we forgot to tell you about how the king of the entire nation killed everyone who was under 2 in an attempt to try to murder Jesus. And so they had to flee the nation as refugees into Egypt. And then months or years later, who knows how long later, they tried to come back, but the king's son was there and they were afraid of him. And so there was another angelic visitation and they were warned to go up north to Galilee. And that's when they actually returned home. But in addition to the fact that that would be just gross negligence on the part of a narrator who claims to be giving a well-ordered account of everything that happened, that presupposes all of those other details do not contradict, such as the fact that in Matthew, they live in Bethlehem and they relocate for the first time to Nazareth as a result of not being able to return to Bethlehem. So those things are overlooked. But then we've got the question of this temporal conjunction, hos, which means as, when, like, after. So can we really read months worth of the most traumatic experiences a person can face into the gap between the completion of the requirements of the law and their returning to their own home in Nazareth? It's logically possible, sure. It's certainly not plausible, and it would be laughable to call it probable, much less certain. But let's take a look at the previous chapter in Luke 1. When Elizabeth hears Mary's voice, Elizabeth says, "Hos, I heard your voice. The babe leapt in my womb." That is the exact same temporal conjunction, but this is immediate and this is as a result of. And then we have the same temporal conjunction being used later when she tells the story again. So in the beginning of Luke, hos is used to indicate immediate temporal succession. This is happening because and immediately after this. And the idea in Luke 2:39 is very clearly, if you want to take the text seriously, that they were waiting to return home until they had completed the requirements of the law. Once they had completed the requirements of the law, they returned to their own home in Nazareth. That's what the text says. But the argument here is you can't tell me it's impossible to read months of traumatic experience, refugee status, running from a king trying to take your life, into the gap in between the completion of the requirements of the law and the returning home to their own city. So the argument is there's a tiny little sliver of not impossible that I have successfully ginned up. And because the main goal of apologetics is to convince people who already believe that they are justified in believing, and all they need is the tiniest little sliver of not impossible, I win. That's the argument. This is not scholarship. This is not taking the text seriously. It's not seeking after the most likely interpretation. It's not trying to understand the text on the author's own terms. It's trying to tergiversate the text, bend it to their own will, to their own ideologies, and to their own dogmas, because fundamentally apologetics is about putting dogmas ahead of the data. And the fit for this video has been, this was the 80s, man.